welcome everyone for joining us today. My name's Ariel Steele with Tax Credit Connection. I think there's a few more people that are just popping in right now. I'm so excited to see such a great turnout today. I think this is our biggest roundtable so far, so this is a really good trend that we're having. And so looking forward to having even more of these every month. We're doing these, so hopefully we keep growing like this. So thank you for spreading the word. So today we're going to be talking about water, and we have two experts with us. First up is going to be Sarah Parmar from Colorado Open Lands, and she'll be talking about a groundwater transaction that she recently closed. We also have Dylan O'Hare from the Palmer Land Conservancy, and he'll be talking about some water transactions that they're working on, or water ideas, on one of the ditches in the southern part of Colorado. So I'm going to have Sarah start off by first, tell us a little bit about you, Sarah, and your experience, and then what you've been working on, and we're all excited to learn.
Great. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Sarah Parmar. I know many of you have communicated with many of you, and I am the Director of Conservation for Colorado Open Lands, which many of you know is a statewide land trust here in Colorado. And we hold easements on about a little over 600,000 acres across the state in almost every county of Colorado. But I'm really excited, and I come to conservation from an agricultural background. I grew up in a ranching community in southeastern Arizona, and my parents started a community conservation group there. So really fortunate to be able to have that ag connection in this work. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I am going to welcome anybody. I have too many things open on my computer apparently, and it's trying to make me choose something. So I'll just do an entire window. There we go. Great. Sorry. Teams is my nemesis, but this is going to be great. Great. So today, can everybody see that? I should double check. I'm sorry, I can't see any of you. So if somebody could give me a verbal, that'd be great. Okay.
We can see it, Sarah.
Great, great. And please feel free, anybody, to ask questions at any time. So yeah, today I wanted to talk a little bit more broadly before we dive into the specific project about this idea of conservation easements as a tool for aquifer recovery, these groundwater focused conservation easements. So pretty much everybody on this call probably knows all these things, but I promise I'll come back to this later. So we all know, conservation easements are governed by a specific state law. They are voluntary, they're permanent, which is important, and they're specifically tailored to the property that they are put on. But they have a lot of common restrictions, typical restrictions. So usually limited or no division of the property, restriction on buildings, restrictions on or prohibitions on mining, certainly no surface mining, restrictions on roads and infrastructure, and importantly, restrictions on water rights. And the lens through which conservation easements are usually drafted is to restrict activities that are going to be incompatible with conservation values. So we're typically looking at limiting or restricting activities to maintain certain conservation values that we believe provide important public benefits. When it comes to water, I think for a long time, we've realized here in the West in particular, where water is a right, usufructuary right, a use right that can be leased or sold, we've realized that it's important to tie water to conservation easements because that water is really what generates a lot of those important public benefits on land. And so most commonly in conservation easements, we're often speaking to surface water rights, and we're talking about the fact that those rights cannot be sold or even necessarily leased. So we're saying thou shalt continue to use these water rights as they have been, as they were decreed for their use. But I think that, you know, as we think about how we treat water in conservation, we have to recognize that we're at a real crossroads, not only here in Colorado, but across the West. And we're recognizing that there is increasing pressure on every single drop of water in our river systems and in our underground aquifers, and we're needing to stretch them to do more and more. So the way that we encumber water in conservation easements for perpetuity has a real impact on how we can approach our water management. So I like this this map. Admittedly, this is from the now outdated Colorado Water Plan version, but the new Colorado Water Plan that was just passed last month didn't include an updated graphic, so I'm going to keep using it because it's mostly still accurate. But this is showing across the river basins of Colorado how much irrigated agricultural land we are expected to lose. So this is a change in irrigated acreage across our state. Total across the state, we're looking at a loss of about 20% of our irrigated agriculture. And this is due to a couple of really key drivers. The first is something that Dylan is going to speak to, which is the conversion of water rights from agriculture to urban use, something we hear a lot about in terms of buy and dry. So permanently changing water rights from irrigated farms and bringing them into city systems, municipal or industrial systems. But the other change that's anticipated is to meet groundwater sustainability needs. So here in Colorado, we think largely about two basins, the Republican Basin on the Eastern Plains, and then the San Luis Valley in the Rio Grande, Upper Rio Grande Basin in the southern part of the state. So I'm going to focus today on talking about the Rio Grande Basin. So if you look at the shape of that river basin, in the next slide, we're going to zoom in on that shape. So you can see that the Rio Grande has its main stem kind of coming from the west here. So the San Luis Valley is bounded on both sides by two major mountain ranges. We have the San Juans to the west, and we have the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east. And then we have this high arid valley in the center, which originally was developed for agriculture through surface water from the Rio Grande Basin, but because people very quickly realized that that was not that it was a fairly variable system, and that if they just drilled wells into the ground, they would have a lot more consistency in terms of their irrigation. Most of the agriculture in the San Luis Valley that we see today is highly groundwater dependent, although there is a lot of mixed use where there are both groundwater and surface water irrigation systems being used. But highly productive agricultural valley, agriculture is critical to the economy and the ecology of this valley. So let's look at some fun pictures, shall we? And think about how water supports these different things.
Hey, Jessica, it's Melissa, Keep It Colorado. How are you?
Oh, we hear somebody on the phone. Sorry.
Okay.
Not anymore.
Okay. Well, I'm calling about two things. The first is a little. Melissa, I think you're unmuted.
There we go. So as we think about these different things that people in the San Luis Valley value, Fishing, of course, is high on a lot of people's list, depending on stream flows. We have some really rich Hispano heritage in the San Luis Valley. There are very valuable potato crops grown in the San Luis Valley, and a lot of people absolutely love, especially this time of year, to come to the San Luis Valley to see the iconic sandhill cranes. And I wanted to share what I thought was a pretty striking statistic, which is that 70% of crane habitat is dependent on private lands in the San Luis Valley. And those types of shallow wetlands that you see in the photo here are really supported by the San Luis Valley's irrigation systems. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as we think about the challenge of the valley. So if we look under the valley's surface, I don't expect people to try to read this. I'll walk you through it, I promise. This is a chart on the left-hand side here. The y-axis, we have acre feet of storage in the valley's largest underground aquifer. On the x-axis, we have years. So this starts in 1976 and it runs through January of 2022. The important thing is that the red line on this graph is what the state of Colorado's Division of Water Resources has determined is a sustainable groundwater aquifer level. Unfortunately, you can see that since kind of the historic drought of 2002, the aquifers have been below that line. So this is not a good trend, certainly. And people in the San Luis Valley have done a lot to try to reverse this trend. They have actually taxed themselves on their pumping rates in order to try to develop funds to find solutions. And they have invested heavily in a federal program called the CREP program, the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, which essentially pays producers in order to fallow their land to stop groundwater pumping. One of the key elements of this program, this federal program, is that it is all or nothing. You are either pumping and irrigating and growing something, or you are not. There's no kind of in-between level. And the challenge is that there has simply not been enough participation or interest in these types of programs to make a difference thus far. And so the groundwater folks in this, the groundwater management folks in this community work very closely with us, and we have great relationships. And we began talking about whether there might be a role for conservation easements to help the community address this pretty daunting challenge. And I think on our part as a land trust, it really required us to think a little bit differently about how we approach conservation easements. So if you think about the heart of a conservation easement, it is a tool that provides an incentive for a private property owner to not do something in order to provide certain public benefits. Typically, again, it's sort of, we think of this as maintaining public benefits. We think of them not doing something in order to continue the flow of these public benefits or conservation values. But in the case of groundwater pumping, the challenge is that the current use actually has these negative impacts at a community scale. And so we started thinking about whether we could use conservation easements to actually incentivize permanent reduced pumping. But this really required us to think about, to really shift from thinking about the conservation values on a particular piece of property to thinking about regional conservation values. So in this case, we're actually using the conservation easement as a tool to change the property significantly, but we're doing that because we recognize that if we change one property, we'll have regional benefits. So we did a series of listening sessions with irrigators across the San Luis Valley There's 7 different sub-districts that cover different tributaries to the Rio Grande and different response areas based on different hydrology. And what we heard over and over again from irrigators was, we would be interested in participating in a program. We want to be part of a solution, but we don't like the existing federal program because it does require us to completely stop farming. And we're farmers and we do it because we love it, not because we're getting rich, but because it's what we want to do. And so what we heard from people was, we really want flexibility and we really want options on a spectrum. On the other hand, what we heard from the groundwater managers was, we're scrambling every single year to try to meet the requirements of the state. And the requirements of the state are twofold. They have to try to improve their aquifer level, and they have to replace depletions to streams that result from that groundwater pumping in order to make sure that they're meeting the Rio Grande Interstate Compact. And so the groundwater managers have these 2 challenges, these 2 pieces of the puzzle that they have to solve every single year. And so they're constantly having to try to negotiate new agreements. So they said, if there's any way for us to find something permanent, that would be ideal. So if we think back to, how we first started this conversation, 2 key elements of conservation easements are that they are permanent and they can be specifically tailored to a property. So we thought, well, given the feedback that we're hearing from these 2 key stakeholders, maybe a conservation easement is a good fit. So as we thought about how we could structure these conservation easements, we did kind of a 2-year feasibility study looking at the legal components, talking with irrigators and groundwater managers, and doing a valuation component as well. So here in Colorado, our enabling statute that allows us to do conservation easements and have those be enforceable under state law, our statute allows for water rights to be included in conservation easements, but it says that they must be included with the land on which those water rights have been used. So we couldn't do a conservation easement on the groundwater alone, but instead we looked at doing a somewhat traditional conservation easement that would include some land restrictions, but really focusing it on limiting groundwater pumping. We did find that including the surface is an important component in many ways, because it actually helps us to provide certainty to all parties that there is going to be some management of those surface resources, and particularly soil resources and weed management, which is important, and I'll touch more on that later. But in terms of the pumping restrictions, what we decided was that we would allow groundwater users, irrigators, to tell us what kind of restriction they thought would be feasible for them. So one farmer might come to us and say, I've got 3 center pivots that I operate, and I think I can rotationally fallow those 3 pivots and reduce my groundwater pumping by 1/3. And so for that particular farm, the restriction on pumping to 2/3 of their use would be permanent. But if there's another generation in the future that finds a different way to farm and still achieve that reduction, that's fine too. So we're not locking in a specific type of management or a specific means of achieving that water reduction. But what's permanent is the reduction in pumping. In terms of how we monitor this, we're used to being able to, go out and visit properties on the ground, or maybe use aerial imagery to look at land use typically. So how do we monitor well use? This is a little bit easier if you're talking about a complete restriction on groundwater pumping, or if somebody's going to completely stop irrigating. But if we're going to allow for kind of a spectrum of use or a percent reduction in use, how do we do that? So some important context is that nearly all of the wells in the San Luis Valley have been metered for the last decade at least. Beginning in 2002 with that historic drought, there was a real shift to getting that good information and metering every single well in the San Luis Valley. And this pumping data goes to both the Rio Grande Water Conservation District, which is essentially the local water conservation management entity, a local governmental entity that's charged with this groundwater management. And it also goes to the state Division of Water Resources, which has the enforcement mechanism really for allowing a well to be used or to be shut off. But here in Colorado and in most prior appropriation states in the West, our water law is use it or lose it. So if you do not use your water, it is subject to abandonment. So we are proposing, as you may imagine, we're proposing in this groundwater conservation easement, we're restricting the use of this water. And so we're proposing that a proportion of it goes unused. So how do we keep that water from being abandoned, which means if it's abandoned, somebody else could potentially claim it for use. So how do we make sure that this water actually remains unused, but isn't lost or abandoned? What we've done in our particular state law, there's an allowance for irrigators to be to participate in a conservation program of a water district. And so we've kind of done two things, sort of a belt and suspenders approach. So we've encumbered that groundwater right in the conservation easement, where we're essentially saying we're holding this for non-use, we're holding this for aquifer recovery, and we're also enrolling it in a sister program of this water conservation district as a partner. And we've really worked with the water district so that we will have a great long-term partnership. So this district will provide us the annual pumping records, and both parties actually have rights under the conservation easement to enforce. And we each have different kind of legal tools or mechanisms that we can use to do that. So for Colorado Open Lands, we could potentially seek an injunction in court to stop kind of the overuse of rights if there were a violation of overuse of that water. And the district has the ability to remove a certain well from its annual plan, which would then trigger the State Division of Water Resources to shut off that well. So we've each kind of partner in this monitoring and enforcement. And I believe the district sees the land trust as a good partner, not only because we're kind of a little bit of a neutral third party, but also because we have access to conservation easement insurance through terra firma to help bring additional funds to bear if it were ever necessary. So what is the incentive to landowners to do this? Most of you are familiar with conservation easement appraisals, so I certainly won't dwell on this. But many of you know that it can be a challenge to protect agricultural land if there's not an imminent threat of development, because if the before value, the fair market value of the land before the easement is as agricultural land, and the fair market value of land after the easement is put in place is still agricultural land, there's often not a lot of value loss or value to that conservation easement. But in this case, because we're essentially limiting forever the potential income value of this property, we're changing its productivity as agricultural land, an appraiser is actually able to measure that change. And that might need to be done through an income analysis to actually show, okay, the farm had X level of productivity, growing potatoes, they could grow this many bushels of potatoes before. Now they can only produce this much on an annual basis. Or in some cases, this might be a comparison of irrigated farm sales to dryland farm sales. And I'll dig into that a little bit in the transaction that we completed. But one of the benefits of this program, especially from the lens of these water districts, these water managers, was that it brings another financial tool to the table, because we believe that these groundwater easements are eligible for traditional easement tax benefits. They should qualify for a federal tax deduction, and in the case of Colorado, a Colorado state tax credit for conservation easements. And these may also align with objectives of different funders. So here in Colorado, the first conservation easement that we did of this type, we were able to secure funding from the Colorado Water Conservation Board, which is a state entity. And we also, we didn't use them for this conservation easement, but we used them in a different way on this project. We were able to secure federal funding through the Natural Resources Conservation Service in their Regional Conservation Partnership Program to apply this concept. Let's see, so I will dig into an actual project. We completed a conservation easement on Peachwood Farms in November of this past year. We were really excited. So here is a picture of the farm prior to the conservation easement, when it was at its height of productivity. So this farm produced oats, peas, and alfalfa. So all for forage. But this property, as you can sort of see in the picture, is irrigated by a center pivot. And in this case, this farm is close to 2,000 acres and is irrigated by 12 center pivots. And so, so these are the 12 pivots, and you can see the land restrictions as well. So this property, this farm, must be sold as a whole, but the landowner did actually keep out some acreage with a home site, and they included a building envelope where there can be a residence and agricultural structures here. There can also be agricultural structures over here on the western side of the property. But the meat of this conservation easement was really, of course, the restrictions on the high capacity wells that were pumping water out of the groundwater, out of the underground aquifers. And so for the circles in blue, the landowner was actually interested in completely retiring these wells. So to be honest, this wasn't actually the pilot project that we expected. We thought that somebody would come to us wanting just a partial restriction on their pumping. But this landowner, and I'll speak a little bit more to why, but was interested in completely retiring these wells in blue and then partially retiring the yellow wells. So those yellow wells are subject to a 50% reduction. The way that the valuation worked on these was that for those wells that were being completely retired, the appraiser looked at irrigated land sales versus dry land farm sales. So it was a pretty direct, easy comparison for the appraiser. It was a little bit harder to think about how the reduction in pumping would affect the value, but he was able to find farms that were water short for some reason, either physically or because there was some kind of limitation on the water right decree. And so he actually used those sales to compare and see what the impact would be on that value. So overall, we were looking at about a 60% reduction in value, or a 60% conservation easement value loss just due to the water component of this project. So this is not what the landowner's values were, but these are just hypothetical values that my colleague Sally put together, who's here as well today. But just to give you a little bit of an example, so in this case, the landowner their conservation easement was valued at about 70% of the total value of the farm between the water restrictions and the land use restrictions. So when we look at the public benefits of what was achieved through this conservation easement, we're essentially saving 1,700 acre feet of water every single year in the aquifer. So we're keeping applied to the surface every single year. The reason that those 5 circles were only limited to half of the pumping rate, the other half actually won't continue to be pumped, but the water district is actually going to use that to augment depletions and increase the flows of San Luis Creek, which is a tributary to the Rio Grande that flows alongside this property. And so these were great water rights to be able to meet that need. And the great benefit of increasing flows in San Luis Creek is that creek actually flows into the Baca National Wildlife Refuge, which provides pretty incredible habitat regionally. The other huge benefit of essentially drying up this farm, of reducing this pumping by so much, is that it actually allows this groundwater district to entirely meet its sustainability. So it allows all of the other farms within this particular groundwater area to continue to operate. So those farms will continue to provide the open space, the habitat, and the economic activity to the region. So just a little bit more about this transaction and the land transition. So the Peachwood Farms owner was a private landowner. He and his wife never had children. And he said, you know, I feel like when I look around, all of my neighbors have a next generation that they're trying to pass their farm to. I don't. And so if anyone is in a position to try to be part of the solution, it's me. And he said, so I would rather completely dry up my farm and have them be able to continue to completely irrigate theirs. But he wanted to do that by selling the farm completely. And what was fortuitous was that this groundwater subdistrict was already interested in purchasing those 5 blue circles for the stream depletion water that they would get from that. And so we crunched the numbers and we approached the groundwater subdistrict and said, well, would you actually be willing to buy all 12 circles? If this landowner does the conservation easement first, you can buy those 12 circles for less than you were going to pay for the unrestricted 5 circles. You'll get the water that you need for stream depletions, and you'll also meet your aquifer sustainability needs through this conservation easement. So the landowner completed the conservation easement first. This was actually primarily a donated conservation easement with a little bit of funding through the Colorado Water Conservation Board and a private foundation. And then the groundwater subdistrict is purchasing the farm at the after easement value. And so it's the groundwater district that will ultimately be responsible for the revegetation of this property. And the revegetation is going to be phased over a number of years. So we're going to do about 3 circles every year. And there's going to be the flexibility to kind of see how that goes. So if there's a really dry year, we could come back and replant or apply a little bit more irrigation water. So we allowed for water to be used in the first 10 years to support that revegetation before it's shut off. And through this NRCS funding, we actually raised funds not only to pay for conservation easements themselves, but to actually help pay for land transition, whatever that looks like for a particular landowner. So in this case, the funds will help pay for revegetation. And I should just say that for the subdistrict, they are helping to finance all of this as well by leasing out the 9 circles that won't yet be revegetated. So the 9 circles will continue to be irrigated in the interim. And they're actually leasing those to someone who's going to grow barley, which is a great, it turns out a great crop that you can easily plant into for revegetation, but it's going to be used to support a local brewery. So we're excited that in the interim, this property will not only be beginning its revegetation, reducing its water use, but also supporting the local economy in the interim. Just because we've done one of these doesn't mean we have everything figured out. And our project manager, Sally Weir, is on today. And Sally's entire job now is to work on these groundwater conservation easements and or support aquifer recovery, whatever that looks like. And Sally has been having tons and tons of conversations with folks over the last few months and presenting at lots of different meetings across the San Luis Valley. And we're certainly identifying some challenges and hopefully some opportunities to accompany those challenges. But one of the challenges is that there are areas where appraisals may not work. And when I say they may not work, that I mean they don't provide an appropriate incentive. So there are areas of the San Luis Valley where the water users are intentionally further restricting themselves or increasing pumping fees to the point where there's a lot of market uncertainty about what the value of that farmland is with those increasing fees. And so the appraisers that we work with are pretty uncomfortable trying to establish a market value with those changing circumstances. The other challenge that we're seeing is that because this groundwater easement is based on a changing use or a lost income, there are lots of farmers who would be ideal candidates because they care about this issue and they're working hard to resolve this issue. But in many cases, they've already worked to reduce their water use over the last 10 years. And so they don't have that history of pumping over the last few years where they're changing the value now through the conservation easement. They've already given up that value voluntarily, just trying to help the situation. And so we're trying to figure out, how an appraisal might work in those circumstances. Interestingly enough, here in Colorado, the state legislature funded a bill last year to support aquifer recovery. And so the Rio Grande Basin has approximately $30 million to use to try to find solutions. And so we're exploring whether we might be able to completely fund conservation easements at 100% value and essentially set a value for these conservation easements that's based more on their value to the aquifer than it is on lost income potential. The other reason that we're thinking about potentially trying to fund conservation easements at 100% funding and not using tax incentives is because a question that a lot of people ask is, well, what am I able to do with this land after it's dry or after it's revegetated? Certainly there will be some opportunities for continued grazing. We want that, but it's a huge economic change to go from valuable cropland to limited pasture land. And so the San Luis Valley happens to be an incredible place for solar efficiency. A solar panel in the San Luis Valley produces nearly twice as much energy as it does in other areas of Colorado. And so solar developers have been eyeing the valley for a long time. It has transmission issues, so those opportunities are currently limited. But we are really starting to think about how we could potentially incorporate solar development into conservation easements, and thinking about whether there might actually be, in some circumstances, benefits in terms of soil moisture retention or shade for wildlife that could be achieved through solar development. So thinking about the where and the how more than just the yes or no. But we're concerned that tax incentives may not currently align with some of those opportunities. But this question of the future, I think, is how do you transition this land at scale? What does the valley economy look like? But what do the resources, what does the land itself look like? So how do you think about revegetation of 20,000 acres a year at a time, which is potentially the type of pace and scale that the valley needs to think about in order to avoid a complete shutdown of wells by the state if they don't achieve their aquifer recovery goals. So we're really looking at partnering with the district to try to support and answer some of these questions. And we don't have all the answers. But I'm actually, if anybody's interested, I'm happy to share these conservation values. But otherwise, I will stop there and see if there are questions now. And if not, I will turn it over.
Yeah, let's take maybe 2 or 3 questions if we have them now, and then we're going to intentionally save time at the end, probably about 15 to 20 minutes. So that we can have a discussion as well as having more questions for both of our experts that are speaking today. So are there any questions right now that someone has for Sarah? You can either go ahead and unmute yourself and just yell it out. You can raise your hand virtually, or you can put it in the chat. Sarah, we're so grateful to you for taking the time to come and do this. This is really exciting, groundbreaking work that you're doing. Taking on both groundwater, having a conservation easement that gives benefits for not doing agriculture is such a twist for all of us. So good job on finding a way to do that. And then if you can tackle the solar issue at the same time, my goodness, this is a lot you bit off, but I'm excited. Mark, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, thanks. Sarah, so good to hear your presentation, and congratulations on the success of the project to date. Very well articulated. As you know, Sarah, you and I have talked in Kansas, here, Southwest Kansas, we're facing similar groundwater situation, and so very interested in this kind of tool. We don't have that compact down at the end sort of driving the goals, but still the need for goals no less for conservation. I think it's interesting how you have tied the groundwater to the land, and then of course the need to address the surface conditions. And our thinking was to what extent we could just encumber the groundwater and let the landowner proceed with his management of the land. But I'm not sure that's possible under conservation easements yet. But I just wanted to say a quick comment that your groundbreaking work is fabulous, and how fortuitous to be able to work with that partner that you found that was sort of in that life circumstance there with his private property. So I just praise to you guys is all, and my name isn't on my little insignia there, so I wanted to at least chime in and say hello.
Oh, Mark, I'm so glad, and it's really interesting because as we're working with the Rio Grande Water Conservation District, there's actually an all-day meeting tomorrow that my colleague Sally and I will join. As the district's trying to think through how they spend this $30 million they're just on such a tight timeline, and I think there is a challenge in terms of conservation easements being taking some time to complete. And so we're also thinking about, they're thinking about just well purchases, and we're thinking about how we can support them in terms of still developing agreements with landowners to do revegetation work. But they're really interested in how they can maybe stretch those dollars further in working with landowners who are interested in not an entire reduction or restriction, but just a partial reduction, and what the price tag looks like for that. So yeah, I think every single farmer that Sally's talked to has a little bit different proposition and a little bit different situation. So certainly not a silver bullet, but thank you, Mark. And yeah, I'm so grateful that we have the connection and can keep talking about things.
Excellent. Let's move over to Dylan now. And Dylan, you'll have until about 11:15 if that works for you, and that'll leave 15 to 20 minutes for discussion at the end for everyone. So thank you so much, Dylan. We're excited to hear a little different twist on water conservation and preservation. So take it away.
Yes, that sounds great. Let me see if I can get my presentation up. Like Sarah, Teams is my nemesis. I'm on Team Zoom, so bear with me for a second. Can y'all see that?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Great. So first, thanks so much for taking the time and effort to host this meeting and bring us all together to have some conversations about what we all believe is a really important issue and topic. So I'm going to be presenting today on the Bessemer Farmland Conservation Initiative, which, as you can see, is a community-driven conservation to protect irrigated farmland and optimize surface water use. To back up a little bit, my name is Dylan O'Hare, and I'm a community conservation manager with Palmer Land Conservancy. And Palmer Land Conservancy is a regional land trust working here in southern Colorado to protect land and water for the well-being of people and for nature. And so for the past 45 years or so, we've been able to work with hundreds of landowners, partners, funders, to protect over 137,000 acres of land here in the southern part of the state. What is really exciting about some of this work, though, is that just over 100,000 of those acres are working farms and ranches. And as I continue to drill down from that 137 to 100,000, there's also, part of that are working farms, irrigated farmland. And that's where some of our really exciting work is happening right now. And that's the Bessemer Farmland Conservation Project. We're working to conserve irrigated farmland here in southern Colorado and hoping to, lead the way and set the stage for that to happen on a larger scale across the state. So, as Sarah alluded to, I'll be talking a little bit more about buy and dry. And just to let you know, I know that many of us live here in Colorado, but not all of us, myself included, are from Colorado. I'm a transplant from Alabama. And as folks like myself move to Colorado, our cities are growing. And in order for cities to grow, we know that they need many, many resources, one of which is water. And so as cities and municipalities continue to grow, they have to find water resources to allow that growth. And the best source of water for a municipality to acquire is irrigated farmland, surface water rights. Not only are the surface water rights on irrigated farmland traditionally large quantities of water, but they're also historic sources of water with very senior water rights. Here in Colorado and in the Rocky Mountain West, the doctrine is first in time, first in right. So, and as the West was settled, the irrigated farmland was often the first water that was put to use. So those are extremely valuable water sources. So as municipalities grow, they search for these water sources. When they do find water resources that they can buy from willing landowners, they purchase the water rights and then go through a process of converting that water from agricultural use to municipal use. Once that conversion has happened, the water will leave the land and be diverted to the municipality with whatever infrastructure they have in place, and that farmland is permanently fallowed, so it is no longer in production. And then after that farmland is fallowed, what we're going to be focusing on, or what I focus on in this work, are the environmental and economic community impacts. So what happens to the land once the water leaves? And this photo behind in my slide right here, this is a good case study for some of the negative impacts of buy and dry. Unfortunately, just to the east of where I am right now in Pueblo County, we have Crowley County, which is in a sense, a poster child for what the most negative impacts of buy and dry can look like. Over the past few decades, Crowley County, farmers in Crowley County sold about 95% of their water rights to growing municipalities. Once that water left the land, what was once an agricultural powerhouse with numerous, sugar processing plants from the sugar beet to support the sugar beet industry, is now one of the poorest counties in the state. In Crowley County, inmates now outnumber residents, and that's because the best industry that can exist in the absence of agriculture is our correctional system. And what you can see in this photo is the result of water leaving land, and that is this incredible dust storm. That photo wasn't taken in Crowley County, but the dust is from Crowley County. The photo was taken in Benton County, just to the east. So as you can imagine, when irrigated farmland is no longer in production, the environmental impacts are severe as well. We have a similar situation in Pueblo County as we did in Crowley. What you
Are other people having a hard time hearing Dylan right now, or is it just me?
Yeah, I think he froze.
Okay, we'll give it a moment and see if he comes back.
You can see here. All right, it looks like I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you so much, Dylan.
All right, great. So back to the Bessemer Farmland Conservation Initiative. So what we have in Pueblo County is that in 2009, Pueblo Board of Waterworks purchased a third of the water shares off of the Bessemer Ditch from farmers in eastern Pueblo County. As you can see in St. Charles Mesa, Vineland, and Avondale, you can see that on the map, it's the farms outlined in red that sold their water. And what is important is that project proponents early on said that when Pueblo Water bought this water, they didn't buy water off of 5,000 acres of farms in Pueblo County. They actually ended up buying water off of some of the most productive farms in Pueblo County. So 63% of the 5,000 acres or so that are going to be dried up are what we have deemed as critical production areas. These are farms with high quality soil and that are have strong economic outputs. And the hypothesis for this project is that if 5,000 of the 15,000 acres are going to be dried up, would it not be better if we strategically dried up farms that are more suitable for dry up rather than some of the most productive and centrally located farms that you can see on this map? And to give you kind of an example of what would be a good candidate for a farm to dry up, you can think of some of the farms that are located along the riparian corridors, so that when dry up occurs, you're not just revegetating and increasing wildlife habitat, natural habitat, but you're also increasing the land's ability to filter nutrients as return flows go back into the system. And so what the Bessemer project has essentially done is it's established an agricultural land and water market, one that can mitigate the impacts of buy and dry, one that can foster business opportunities for remaining farmers, and one that can enable conservation groups to work with farmers on enhancing production and ecology throughout the region. And I'll tell you about how we can do all of those things over the course of this presentation. To give you an idea of where this all started and where we are now, I think it's helpful to look at a timeline. You can think of 2009 as the original purchase of the water rights, but after Pueblo Board of Waterworks purchased the water rights from the farmers, they then leased them back to the farmers to 2029 and have then extended those leases to 2039. And in that, what that lease period has done is it's given us an opportunity, a window of time to develop these solutions that you can see here and that we'll continue to talk about. So during that lease period, Harvard, the University of Harvard, I don't know, we just call it Harvard, they invested in an investigation to explore this hypothesis and the value proposition associated with drying up strategically versus drying up as Pueblo Water purchased water rights in the free market. And you can see that in the first few years, there was a lot of research done, a lot of community building done between both Harvard, Innovative Conservation Solutions, and the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. As we moved into 2017 and 2018, the Bessemer Project Association was formed by the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union and Palmer. And the reason that that was done was to create a single voice and a united front that represented the community and the conservation outcomes that they wanted to see. So that in 2017, when Pueblo Board of Waterworks filed for the change case from agricultural water to municipal water, Palmer was there with a voice at the table to propose solutions. And what that solution is a provision that was added into the decree during the change case that was settled in 2019. And what this decree allows for is the transfer of water from one farm on the Bessemer Ditch to another, which seems extremely simple, but as is the case with all water-related discussions in Colorado and in the West, it is not as simple as it may seem, and it is got rife with legal and hydroengineering complexity. So we were able to settle the case with Pueblo Board of Waterworks in 2019, which has moved us into kind of the current iteration of the project right now. As we have fundraised for this project, there are institutional and state donors that are interested in seeing the potential for this project because of its scalability to other regions. And that's why there has been investment from Harvard, from think tanks in Arizona, from software development companies in the Pacific Northwest, and from the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And so right now where we're at is we are in the fundraising process for an acquisition fund that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And we're also working with the Colorado Water Conservation Board on a pilot project through the support of a grant. And what that pilot project is what we aim to do with that pilot project is to initiate the first use of the provision that was added into Pueblo Water's change case. It's a water substitution that moves water from from a marginally productive farm that's located along a riparian corridor to a more productive farm that originally sold its water in 2009. So the way that we're able to do that with a toolkit that we have developed in conjunction with tools that already exist in the country and in the state of Colorado. So I've been talking about the substitution of dry up provision. That's the legal tool that we have at our disposal that allows for the transfer of water from one farm to another, making better use of limited water supplies in the event of a dry up. The Bessemer project also is going to we are also leveraging the use of traditional real estate transactions, the things that we're all used to in the land trust community, things like conservation easements, but also fee acquisitions to support substitutions as well. At the end of the day, our work in conservation is also driven by relationships, and so our community engagement has been a driving force from the beginning of this project. It wasn't Palmer's idea to stand up and propose solutions when the water was sold. It was the community that did that. So this project is really harnessing the community voice, and we're building relationships to move this project forward from a technical basis. And then it's money that makes these projects go round, right? And so we have been able to fundraise from public and private sources. We're also planning to leverage state tax credits, federal deductions through the use of conservation easements during one of these transactions. And there are two types of transactions that you could expect to see coming from this project. And what those are there is a landowner assist and a buy protect sell, both of which are commonly used in the conservation world. A landowner assist transaction would see Palmer simply facilitating the substitution of water from one farm to another. This would mean that there's a landowner out there, and there are, that owns two different types of farms. Think a marginally productive farm with owned water and an extremely productive farm that has leased water. If a landowner has both of those pieces to the puzzle, we can simply facilitate the transaction. There's also the buy, protect, sell model though, and that's why we are using PRIs and other sources of funding to raise an acquisition fund. So that puts us in a position to purchase both of those pieces of the puzzle. Again, a marginally productive farm with owned water and a productive farm with leased water, so that we can purchase both, facilitate the substitution, and then offload both of those farms to working landowners. And that part is important because as a land trust, we're certainly not farmers. We don't intend to be land owners, nor do we know the best practices for the land. That's the landowner's job. So our goal is to facilitate these substitutions, place conservation easements on the properties, and then get them back into the hands of working landowners. This is a big and a complex project that is, I would say, rife with challenges as well. As I've been able to tell you so far, it's complex. And one example for that is not all acres are created equal. You can't just say that I want to move water from one acre to another. The historic consumptive use actually has to line up. So if one farm has traditionally used more water than another, it would be easy to transfer that water shares from that farm to the other, but not vice versa. So we're looking at just complex hydroengineering on an irrigation ditch. And as you can imagine, that hydroengineering, as well as the legal costs associated with doing something like this, are high. And those are fixed costs that are going to exist for any transaction. So that's a challenge that we are working to address through different sources of funding. This hypothesis, this value proposition, also exists in a free market. And as water substitutions happen and land values change as water is put to more productive use, land values can be impacted elsewhere as well, which could in turn impact the value proposition of this project. When we're talking about the landowners themselves, we know that many working landowners are busy. They're focused on tending to the land. They are running their own businesses where they are price takers up and downstream, where they don't have control of their environment. They're busy folks, and getting them on board with complicated real estate transactions is difficult. That's why right now, this time of year for me is incredibly busy, because the farmers aren't as busy as they normally are. This is tractor repair season, and irrigation season starts on March 15th. I also mentioned the leases. Public Board of Waterworks leased those water rights back until 2029, and those leases have been extended to 2039. So we haven't seen any changes in irrigation on the ditch at all. And so that's created in a sense of complacency. Nothing's changed, nothing's going to change for 16 more years. And it's totally possible that Public Board of Waterworks extends the leases again. So without a sense of urgency, it can be difficult to incite action, especially when folks are busy. So these are challenges that I'm trying to work around and mitigate. And then lastly, we're working in a voluntary real estate market. All of our conservation work is voluntary. And we're talking about willing buyers, willing sellers, landowners who are willing to put conservation easement restrictions on their land. And we're also talking about a real estate market that it's a free market. It doesn't have conservation goals. We do. And so if a farm comes up for sale that would be an ideal candidate to protect, if nobody is in a position to buy that and it is scooped up by a landowner that doesn't have a conservation oriented mindset or isn't interested in the project, then that's a missed opportunity. So the ability to act quickly in the real estate market is a challenge as well. But all of these challenges are opportunities, and the opportunities with this project are what make it exciting. It's what's garnered interest from around the country, within the state, and here in this forum. Thank you for inviting me, Ariel. And so when we're looking at the opportunities of this project, there are conservation related opportunities. We have a chance to retain a critical mass of irrigated farmland in production in a place where a significant water acquisition from a municipality has occurred. What conserving that critical mass of irrigated farmland will do for Pueblo County is the opposite of what's happened in Crowley County. It is an opportunity to safeguard a community with deep, rich, multi-generational heritage. It is an opportunity to make sure that the agricultural way of life that Pueblo so identifies with is viable long into the future. What's really exciting, though, is the scalability and the way that this project and the innovation here can be leveraged, not just throughout the state, but throughout the Rocky Mountain West. We're all aware of the water resource situation in the arid Rocky Mountain West, and there is the increasing pressure on our water resources isn't going to stop. And so if we can show that this is a viable way forward that allows for municipal use and conservation outcomes, then that is it's an opportunity to leverage co-benefits in a way that we haven't really seen before. And so that's where we fall back on conservation as a solution. What the Bessemer project has to offer as a solution is an opportunity for Pueblo Board of Waterworks to get every drop of water that it purchased in a free market. It allows for the agricultural economy, assuming that this project moves forward to not just maintain its productivity, but perhaps enhance its productivity. This project's an opportunity for the environment to benefit as riparian corridors and natural habitat are expanded, and the land's ability to improve water quality is enhanced. It's an opportunity for communities to stay whole. It's an opportunity for the Pueblo chili to continue its meteoric rise over the Hatch chili. That's my personal bias. And it's an opportunity for these communities, like I said, to continue their way of life in agriculture. So that's a high level flyover of the project. And Ariel, thank you for your time here. And I'm happy to, answer any questions. I think it's, Ariel, it's time to open it up to both of us, or I'm happy to field them, whatever works for you.
Yes, let's open it up. I just wanted to first of all say thank you so much, Dylan. It's really exciting to hear about your project and hear about it in detail, because we've just talked about it for 5 minutes here and there. So I love learning about how it's going to work. And what I've noticed with both you and Sarah is the key to your projects being successful is engaging with the stakeholders. Both of you talked about that, and I think that's a really common theme, which is why I'm excited that we have so many people on this call today, because we all need to figure out what's going to be best for the people that are affected and not just be thinking about this in terms of what we think as conservationists are the best way forward. So let's see what questions we have right now. Either it can be for Dylan specifically or for both Dylan and Sarah. And then once we exhaust questions, if we still have some time left, I'd like to open it up to just hear the projects that the people who are in the audience are working on, so we can help connect each other, brainstorm together, and things like that. So what questions do we have? What a quiet group. I may start calling on you guys if you don't come up with questions yourselves. So, no, I actually would like to, maybe we'll start with this part first. Let's hear from the folks in the audience who are working on water related projects, a little bit about what your interests are, what you're currently working on, and if there's anything from today that is going to help you in yours, or do you have ideas that could help Sarah and Dylan in their projects? So I want to open that up for a conversation. And please don't be shy. This is where the really juicy stuff happens, is when we get to share. Okay, I'm going to call on Greg, because Greg, I know you're working on some cool projects, so you're going to be the first one to get everyone rolling.
Okay, I will prime the pump, so to speak.
Thank you.
So I'm working on a project, and it's called the Northern Integrated Supply Project, and the integration comes from wanting to work with 2 specific ditch companies in the Poudre River Basin. And we want to trade water, provide additional water, and make sure that those companies stay viable. I guess my question and some of the challenge that I'm facing, and how you've addressed it, is how you continue to engage with stakeholders and find the motivations, or in some cases, like I was thinking about the picture that Dylan, that you shared of Bent County and the Crowley County dust blowing across. I mean, that's compelling. And Sarah, when you talk about the hammer from the federal government to reduce groundwater levels, that's compelling. But if you have landowners who are doing things just fine and things seem great, how would you suggest helping them see what the benefits of these programs are?
I'm happy to start. Yeah, it seems, I know, and obviously Greg, we know each other and you work with Carmen a lot. And we've talked a little bit about this, but sometimes I think it takes time to plant the seeds. And when there's not the sense of urgency, I know, I was telling a colleague the other day, we had a project in the Gunnison Basin where a family called us up a couple of years ago and they said, you all did a presentation a while back and we said we'd think about it and we thought about it, and that was 15 years prior. So I think it's people knowing about the options so that when the timing is right for them, and that's always the challenge, is that alignment of timing and values, financial values, and the fundraising, I think, that Dylan spoke to. But I think if they don't know that the option is on the table, they're going to make a different choice. and as you know, that's often just putting something on the market. And so I think in your case, folks knowing that Northern is a buyer potentially, you know, if somebody is looking to get out, that not only are you a buyer, but you're going to make sure that their farm stays in farmland as opposed to being covered in houses. I think that does mean something to people, and if they have the dialogue and the awareness, even if it's not happening now, I think when the time is right for them, they know who to go to, and that's important.
Yeah, and I can add a little bit there. The folks that we're dealing with, the stakeholders on every side of this roundtable, tend to be risk averse. And what we're working towards addressing is proof of concept. That's a way of de-risking what is an uncertain proposition. A substitution for us, in this case, a substitution has never been done before like this. And why would a landowner want to bet on something that is uncertain, that hasn't been done before? So working to get past that proof of concept stage is a way for us to, you know, be able to show what can be done, so that when the timing is right for people, they have something that they can look to kind of see what their future might look like as well.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate you jumping in there. Does anyone else have any questions or any thoughts or projects they want to share with the group? All right. Well, I'm extremely grateful to both of you. Oh, Mark, please.
Yeah. You know, again, I really appreciate just listening about the ideas, and Dylan and all of the work that they've done on that ditch system. This is sort of adding a wrinkle, but sometimes the innovations that the teams that Dylan's working with create potential tools to address other concerns in the basin. And one that we have downstream, so to speak, in Kansas is the quality of the water. And it's not just us, it's the whole basin. And so, you know, finding ways to engage the stakeholders directly, but then when it's on multiple states, through the proper state agents as well, that's something we're looking for. And if we're concerned about uranium from Colorado, for example, it shouldn't be a compact issue, because all of a sudden the clam's shut, you know, and nobody's talking and collaborating. So setting that aside and trying to have these conversations sort of farm to farm is really where it's at for basin health. And when it comes to uranium, a lot of work done, for those of you, you know, paying attention to that, by CSU and the hot spots, if you will, of where the productive irrigation ground is happening above the black marine shales. And if there are ways to trade, like Dylan's project is doing, move water from less productive or maybe hotspot fields to other fields, so that in a way that people can preserve values, and yet we can address the leaching of the marine shales and the concentrating of the uranium, for example. I think that's where some of these tools can be applied in a collaborative and a friendly way for the stakeholder. You don't know what you can do until you talk about it, but it's certainly more preferred than coming at it through courts or other means. So I just appreciate learning and hearing what Dylan and his team has done, and maybe how those tools can apply in engaging stakeholders in a basin sense. So just a comment, I guess, not so much a question.
Well,
That's great. This is what we want. We want the conversation.
Yeah, I could respond to that. Thanks for sharing. You know, the idea of not using the C word to, incentivize action, but to have conversations, like you said, farm to farm to incentivize action. It makes total sense. And I can pull an example from this project for what we've done to kind of move the needle forward. But generally speaking, it's about finding the table, creating the space for the conversation. And the way that we have really started to do that started about 2 years ago by creating a position here in Pueblo in the community, so that those conversations can happen organically. I'm here, I'm out on the Mesa frequently, just running into folks, and it's those side conversations that you didn't plan for that tend to be the most productive in my experience. And so, yeah, being there, finding whatever that table is for you is, to me, definitely the best way to move things forward. It's all relationships. We do things with each other, right?
Yeah, and I appreciate Sarah's point too, where she pointed out that sometimes you plant the seed and then 15 years later, all of a sudden, hey, there's something there to work with.
15, that's impressive, Sarah.
Yeah. I didn't think Sarah was that old, but oh well.
I can't say I was the one who planted that seed, although next month I will have been at COL for 15 years.
Wow.
But I didn't plant that seed specifically.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Well, Ariel, thank you.
Ariel, you're
so
on mute.
much.
Thank you. Yeah, I just realized I'm chatting away and on mute. Yes, I just was going to check one last call for any other questions or thoughts that folks want to share. All right. Well, Sarah and Dylan, it has been a huge pleasure. I'm sure you've inspired all of us to think creatively, whether it's around water or whether it's around other issues. You've taught us about how to engage stakeholders. You taught us how to be patient, how to take advantage of a situation when someone has a life circumstance that makes them a really good candidate for something. Sometimes it's just waiting to find the right person to go first, who's willing to be that, create that proof of concept, as Dylan was talking about. So I think there's a lot of lessons we can take from this talk, even beyond all of the great work you're both doing in regards to water. So thank you again for being here. If you two have anything you'd like to say in wrapping up, that's great. Otherwise, we'll just say goodbye. Do you have anything you'd like to say for closing remarks?
Nah, just thanks. Thanks for having us.
Pleasure.
Agreed. I really appreciate it. Yeah, and it was fun. I got to be part of the Bessemer huddle. I think that was like 5 years ago now, and it's just great to connect across folks who are thinking about the nexus of land and water. So thanks to all of you.
Excellent. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.